also did an interview with David. David this morning was near the Canadian border, I think. He's a distinguished professor at Middlebury College in economics, but he's taught at Vassar and Columbia. He's been at Oxford and Princeton. So what we're going to do is basically have David go through just a quick summary of the book and some of the major points in this book. It's a pretty interesting read. And I think it's worth, if you're interested in complexity and sort of this interface with public policy, it's definitely, this is a book worth buying and thinking about.
That's what I like to hear.
I'm going to do the pitch for the book. I'm going to hand around also, since we're actually starting a whole series of these discussions, if you're not on our mailing list, I'm going to hand out a piece of paper and just pass it around. All we need is your email address, and next time we anticipate doing a paper release. We're going to be doing a bunch of discussions specifically on complex systems and public policy. So if you want to sort of keep in the loop on that, just sign up. So I think I'll turn it over to David. He's going to go through that, and then I will then have a little short discussion with him on some points, and then we'll open it up for questions. Thank you.
So thank you all very much for coming and for being here. What I'm going to try and do is go through it very, very briefly. I think discussion is much more important than really presentation and everything else. So what I want to do is give you a broad sort of sense of here's the arguments we make in the book, and then, so open it up for discussion as much as possible. So first, how many of you are economists, just out of interest? How many are not economists then? Sort of that's, what would the other people be? What backgrounds are? Nurse? Mm-hmm. Public policy? Educator, okay. So again, so what I want to talk about, there's a certain way economists have of looking at things. I don't know, you can tell when economists are around. Sort of, it's bred into them. Perhaps it's by selection, perhaps it's by training, but it actually, is, you can tell, economists. And so I want to give a very brief history of economists' policy narrative, because I think it isn't well understood by non-economists, and it probably isn't very well understood by economists either. I'm a historian of economic thought who sort of follows where do ideas come from, and that's one of my interests. So that's the first thing I thought I'd talk about. The second is really sort of go in and say, here's the complexity policy narrative. How does it differ from economists' policy narrative that's there? The third one is sort of how, if we take complexity seriously, how does it change the way we think about policy? And the last part is really to give you one example, the example I'm currently working on that I see as an application of complexity policy to public policy as you're going on. Economics is often divided into classical and neoclassical. Classical goes back to Adam Smith and to John Stuart Mill are really the key ones there. And the key element of their policy narrative is that there is no general model of the economy, that science and policy interrelationships are way too complicated to have a model. So you're not going to have a theoretical model. And Mill had this argument that theory is at best a half-truth, and you have to integrate it with that. He tried to sort of develop a model, and of course he had a nervous breakdown. So he sort of pulled himself back by discovering the Romantic poets and sort of said, oh yes, there's something more to life than what economists see. And that's sort of how it evolved and developed. But there was a strict separation of this discussion of policy and this discussion of models. So you have theory and the models that were there, and they do something. What relevance do they have for theory or for policy? Nothing. So here is, Nassau Sr. was sort of the first methodologist within economics. And economists' conclusions, whatever be their generality and their truth, do not authorize him in adding a single syllable of advice. That privilege belongs to the writer or statesman who has considered all the causes which may promote or impede the general welfare of those whom he addresses, not to the theorist who has considered only one, though among the most important of those causes. The business of political economists is neither to recommend nor to dissuade, but to state general principles that it is fatal to neglect, but neither advisable nor perhaps practicable to use as the sole or even the principal guide to the actual conduct of affairs. So there was really, here we do theory, it's talking about, before we can talk about policy, we've got to add all this other stuff. There's ethics out there, there's sensibility, there's, sort of just social issues, there's norms, cultural issues. They all had to be integrated, so policy was out there separately as part of social science. Economic theory was a very narrow sense, and they defined it as sort of the study of material welfare. And that's all it was. Welfare, more broadly, economists didn't have anything to say about. So that was very much part of the classical economist narrative. That changed in the 1930s. It started to change, and it really changed in the 70s. Not, as it's often presented, as economics moved from classical to neoclassical, because a lot of the so-called neoclassical economists, which would include Marshall, Keynes, and Robbins, were actually followers of this classical methodology. So you did theory out there, and we talked about rational people and what happens and everything else. Why did you do it? Because we could analytically analyze it, and we could get measures of it. We knew that policy had many more dimensions. We forgot that in the 1930s as the Walrasian revolution occurred within economics. Okay, so, it was really sort of people adopting a general equilibrium framework. And that sort of led to this attempt to sort of say, here we now have a model of the aggregate economy. Before, Marshall said you can't have a model. You can have at best partial equilibrium models, little things there. A general model is way beyond what we can do. Why? Because it's too complex. And we don't have the mathematics to deal with it. So you have to sort of jump outside the mathematics to deal with policy. That started to change, and really Abba Lerner, who I worked with and wrote with, was one of the people who sort of led that by writing a book called The Economics of Control. And it really said, he was non-mathematical, but he was visionary in the sense of sort of seeing the arguments and able to create it, and he developed sort of the welfare theorems before it was actually fundamentally developed. About that same time, economists were discovering multivariate calculus. And that was a discovery that sort of allowed them to sort of specify things in general equilibrium models that were much, much more complicated than anything before, and able to see relationships. And it was extraordinarily useful. It was a rich time in terms of economics. It's developed as it did. Paul Samuelson, in his Foundations, which was sort of the theoretical statement of it, and in his Principles text, which really became sort of the structure of Principles text within economics, he built Lerner's economics of control policy narrative into economist policy narrative. So that's how we started talking about it. So the difference here is before, in classical, economists had nothing to say about policy unless it was sort of added and adjusted for all these other variables. Now, economists had something definite to say about it, and all those other variables sort of got pushed aside, sort of not there, and that started focusing on it. The good people, if you read and go back and read the literature, they're always pointing out that there's, limitations and everything. But as it got sort of evolved into the policy narrative, that was lost. So all the qualifications and everything else. And so that really developed into the economics of control policy narrative, which is pretty much the dominant policy narrative that's out there now. And that is, sort of you have, government is seen as an outside controller. Why? Because the mathematics needed that. Here you have a control theory, which is what it is. So it's optimal control theory. Here you have a controller trying to control people who are greedy. And sort of they will do it, and can we devise sort of how will it operate? Well, first they looked, in certain cases, under certain assumptions, greedy people, by the invisible hand, can be led to leading the correct result. That's sort of the market. So market efficiency analysis was there. But then there's problems, externalities, monopoly, so a variety of problems that government has to come and correct. So that's the story economists tell. So what's the externality going on? sort of thinking there. And that's how policy was framed. Government is trying to correct it and sort of get it to what the market would be if the market were perfect. That's fundamentally different than the classical policy narrative, but it became, sort of very much that. And that very structured the way economics was taught, which became taught as a mathematical science more and more. And really a mathematical science designed around optimal control theory, then around optimal dynamic stochastic control theory. So you can make that sort of add more and more dimensions to it and make it harder and harder, but it's still control theory that's going there. You have a controller trying to sort of figure out and do what's right. So somehow you've got to say this controller knows what's right and sort of operating. That brought a reaction from the pro-market supporters, because really that control story is one of government sort of solving problems. And they said that doesn't fit with the way we have it. So you have that Chicago sort of reaction to it, that here what's called market fundamentalism. The market will solve all the problems. And that really goes back to sort of an evolutionary story that's told. Here people voluntarily trade one with another, and as they voluntarily trade, they solve problems. So therefore, if there's no transactions cost, and this is the Stigler version of the Coase theorem, the market can solve it all on its own. So that became sort of the market fundamentalist creed, sort of that particular story. So you have one where we need the government to come in control. One said we don't need the government. Now, the textbooks lean towards the control policy model. The reason for that is 85% of the market wants to tell that story. 15% of the market, I know because I'm a textbook author, sort of there. And we use focus groups, very much to decide what we put in. Don't think textbooks sort of say what person wants to say. They say what will sell, and then here I'll sort of modify it somewhat to go. But it's designed around this control model, and that's what we're teaching. Sort of you maximizing individuals, maximizing utility, government sort of policy, sort of trying to maximize the social welfare function, and we analyze that and provide the structure for how people think of problems, how people think of policy that's going on. And so, of course, we have to come out neutral in that. So we really have sort of market failure, but we also have government failure. So here, government can't figure out what the right thing is to do, or the politics don't allow them to do that. And so the debate that's presented within the text and within the way economists think of it is here you have government failure and market failure, and you're sort of relating the two of them and trying to figure out. So that's the way in which, the story we tell. Now, as all this was happening, sort of that really happened by the 70s, 80s. That was pretty well established, sort of as here's the way things are seen. Now, multivariate calculus died out really, on the cutting edge in economics back in the 60s. As it moved to set theory, a whole variety of things sort of looking on. And, sort of economics started to change sort of because the technology changed. So I look at a field and the technology, the analytic technology available to it very much determines what it is and how it operates. So you started to get, nonlinear stochastic models being able to sort of be solved. So you had solution sets for them. And you got agent-based models, computers, that could actually analyze systems that were unsolvable. So you could now start looking at much, much more complicated sets of systems that you couldn't operate before. And then a famous sort of seminar occurred at Santa Fe, so where they brought physicists who were working on these issues and economists together. And sort of the physicists said, economists, sort of have this structure of things that's way, way too simple. And so there was this interplay, and economics, sort of the complexity revolution, which I won't talk much about here, but within science, there was this complexity revolution that people started to say, we have the tools now by which we can understand a complex system better. And one of the keys to that is really replicator dynamics. Okay, as opposed to saying, here, to understand a system, we have to specify the equations. No, within replicator dynamics, what we have to do is to understand what are the processes of change. So it's very much a biological approach in thinking of it. What are the rules of change? Those rules can be very simple, but they can lead to very, very complex systems that have lots of dimensions. So as opposed to the sort of standard Walrasian economic model, which has a single equilibrium, within complexity, you have basins of attractions and multiple equilibria, 500,000, 600,000 equilibria that might be out there. And you go to one of them and then, sort of move from one to the other. How does that happen? How do we occur? How do we choose among equilibria? Those are all theoretical ideas that economists hadn't looked at, and that mathematicians and scientists were starting to look at. So that's sort of this complexity revolution, which really was the development of agent-based modeling, computers, and analytic technology to understand highly interactive systems that we couldn't understand before. And so you had a lot of that, so people started to think of sort of complexity as this highly, highly mathematical structure and sort of operating. And it is. Well, what did sort of the structure that they were doing have to do with policy? And that's really what our book is about, which is really sort of looking at and saying, here, sort of, if you have the system, the role of government in a control framework is really, Abel Lerner gave this wonderful story, really, we're allowing the economy to operate without anybody driving it. And so what we need is a driver. And it sort of added that driver to it. Okay, the way I think of it in terms of complexity, we're riding a bull. And the hope is that we can stay on and perhaps slightly influence it. So we don't have an economics of control, we have an economics of influence. So therefore, we've reduced the level in which we can actually affect things. But at the same time, sort of, we can broaden sort of the way in which, so we can think of policy and how it can operate. So whereas before, sort of in the economics of control, we assumed rational individuals. And why? Because we needed the math to work. Now, of course, behavioral economics is very much operating, and we have non-rational individuals. Well, semi-rational, there's all kinds of sets of issues there. But economists are looking at that. If you place these new behavioral individuals within the control model has nothing to say because it had to assume full rationality in order to sort of develop the math. So now you have something where here we have mathematical tools that can help us see these issues, not providing a general theory as Walrasian economics did, but providing useful ways to look at particular problems. So that, again, is going back to the way the classical saw theory. That theory sort of gives us an insight. And I tell the story of the economist searching for his keys under the streetlight. Does everyone know that story? All the economists do, but the non-economists probably don't. So here you had this economist went out to a party. Yes, we do go out to parties. And they got drunk. And so the economist was out there and, sort of crawling on his knees, looking for his keys. And along comes some, say, anthropologist and say, what happened? Oh, I lost my keys. Here, let me help you. So they search for a while and sort of try and find it. And then, they don't have any luck. And finally, he looks at the economist. Well, where did you lose them? Oh, I lost them way over there in the dark. Why the hell are you searching here under the light? Well, because that's where the light is. Now, that's a story often told by sort of critics of economics to say how stupid economists were for their model. That's not the way I tell the story. Because if you're searching, where are you going to search other than where the light is? But the question is, what are you actually searching for? If you're searching for the keys, it's absolutely stupid. If you're searching to understand sort of the topography, sort of what's the feel of different ways of systems, and then relate it to say somebody out there in the dark sort of feeling their around. Here, this might be there. You might be on this precipice. This might be the territory. So you have different territories that'll fit. And a key element of what you're looking for is sort of what's the fitness sort of that you're finding here compared to the feel that's occurring out there. So it's going back but using the science. But that only works if the science doesn't claim to have the answers. It simply claims to sort of be providing some useful sort of sensibility of what happens if you have. You're in a nonlinear system where you suddenly have this sudden jump in movement. What happens as you get to a tipping point? Now, a lot of this stuff is starting to get in the general discussions now. So tipping points you've all heard about. But that came from the complexity science analysis that you're starting to see, because you'll have slow-moving variables and fast-moving variables. And so social norms are slow-moving variables. And so as you affect something and choose something, you're affecting all these other variables. How are you affecting them? When are you affecting them? Those are questions that economists don't look at. Those are questions that have to be looked at, and that are fundamental really to policy in thinking about it. And sort of that's what I see complexity adding back to the policy discussion. So what it does is sort of say, all questions are on the table. Sort of we ask what's reasonable and develop that. We'll develop very specific scientific models that may or may not be useful for particular things. That happens, for discussion over time. So it isn't where we have any answers. Maybe that's why economists aren't so wild about this, because, within the control framework, economists have all the answers. Here it's saying there's much more than economics. There's all these other dimensions. Economists have an important part of it, but it is not all of it because we're not analyzing all that. Now, the implications for complexity policy for economist research is, number one, theory becomes less important. Applied work solving real problems becomes dominant. So really, what you're trying to do, show me the problem you have, because we don't have a general answer. But here we have a whole set of different models there that might provide some helpful guidance in thinking about this. Okay? It's not a control model. It's an influence model. So you think about policy, how can we influence this thing? And in the book I describe it with parenting. Sort of, you can't control your kids, or at least I couldn't control my kids. But you can influence them. And sort of understanding how you influence them, which isn't telling them, here, do this, because they'll do the opposite. But you better build that in and sort of have that sensibility that's operating there. An engineering rather than a scientific methodology sort of dominates in policy. So an engineer sort of asks, what works? And show me how it works. A scientist says, what's the truth? So in complex systems, who knows what the truth is? Who cares? Because the question is, what works? Policy focuses a lot more on changing institutions rather than just incentives. Because incentives are embodied in the institutions. And only if you understand the deep way in which incentives gets buried into the institutional structure can you understand what's going on. As economists are developing sort of sets of equation models, the institutions are way too complicated to sort of build into the stuff. So you lose some of the implicit incentives that are out there. And sort of this adds it back. Models in mathematics are to be used more in a Marshallian sense as a tool that you have, as opposed to Samuelsonian sense that it gives you the overall framework. Okay? Nonlinear models become much more important. You start to have tipping points, multiple equilibria. How do you move from one equilibrium to another? Sensitive dependence on initial conditions. Lots of sort of stuff that's discussed we'll have models for it. And your question, you're looking at a policy, is it this problem or is it that problem? So it's matching models to problems, not here's the model that solves everything. Policy is time and position sensitive. So it isn't as if here we can say, here's what we would have done last month. What we may do this month may be different because you're trying to build that in. And policy is discussed not as economic policy, but as social policy, which means that you add back sort of the social elements to it and sort of move to what Nassau Senior called a statesman. So a statesman's role is to consider all the elements. And the statesman is the one who sort of guides on policy, not the economist itself. And sort of just want to give one example of what I'm working on now. So before, when I wrote a book with Abba Lerner, we wrote a control book. It was about what to do with inflation. And we sort of had, sort of a solution to inflation that we developed and how it would operate and solve all of inflation. It didn't sell. Actually, they called me up to the White House, sort of come up, and Alfred Kahn was there at the time, and sort of came in and, sort of discussed it with me, and said, you want me to make a change that's more major than the introduction of the Federal Reserve? He said, I just got in enormous trouble by, do you remember the banana story that he had? Sort of you weren't allowed to say you went into a recession. So what he said is, you're going bananas. And he got into enormous trouble from that. He said, I don't want anybody to know that you were up here to see me. I did not talk to you. That's when I decided maybe I'll stick outside of policy and sort of operate on that. But, sort of, at that time, sort of that's the way I thought about policy. Now I think about it as sort of an Elinor Ostrom sort of analysis of here we have a space, and it isn't the market versus the government, because once you take a complexity view, they evolve simultaneously. So if you're talking about an evolutionary view within that, the market and the government have evolved. They're both institutions that have evolved over time. You can only understand them by understanding their interrelationship and how they work. You can't talk about the market independently of the government, and you can't talk about the government independently of the market. So we distinguish policy here, sort of bottom up versus top down. That's a different dimension than exists within the normal structure. And so that's what we're doing. And the thing I'm working on right now is for-benefit institutions. Now, if you think of it, we have an institutional space that has for-profit institutions that are supposed to be out just to make profit. They aren't. They're much, much more complex than that. And were seen as much more complex until sort of really the 1970s sort of tried to build that in. An economist's view got built into the actual view that was out there. But they're much more complicated than just trying to make a profit. How did they deal with it before? Well, economists had two types of profit. They had, sort of monetary profit, but they also had sort of psychic profit, psychic income. People have social goals. I teach at a liberal arts school. There's enormous interest in sort of doing something good for society. People want to do that. And you go back to Adam Smith, and he, of course, wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments before he wrote The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations was an addendum to the theory of moral sentiments to show how, when you're trying to do good, sometimes you're better off sort of allowing things to develop on their own. And so, sort of that operated. We're trying to sort of specify it. What it's led me into is sort of all kinds of governance issues. How do we design government issues to allow sort of people who have social goals to evolve and develop and sort of achieve those social goals? So social entrepreneurship is a course I'm teaching now on how we develop that. And I'm working how we can specify, these goals. So it leads you quite apart from the standard way in which economists think into quite different things. Because, so if you have a whole bunch of institutions, that are for benefit, which combine sort of achieving social goals and achieving profit, then what you have is a whole different operation of the system that's operating there. So I recall it oftentimes sort of operating, sort of on the embryo, sort of changing it, making it easier for individuals to allow their social goals to come out. So one of the projects my students are working on is, can they develop a student pledge that would go along with the billionaire's pledge? So how much money is enough? You specify that, and having specified that, you write it down, it's voluntary, but at least you've thought about it and said, here at this point I will start worrying about social goals. The way I got into this is a bunch of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs made $100 million by the time they were 25. That's a real problem. What are you going to do with your life at that point? And they started to say, well, I'll give some money away. And then they started to look, here's giving money away to these nonprofits. They're not efficient. I don't like it. Who's the only one can make it efficient? These are entrepreneurs, remember. They are. Well, what's the vehicle through which we can do it? Well, for-benefit institutions. We need to sort of redesign the system to have a lot more for-benefit institutions, so that's what we can focus on. And so that's one of the projects that falls out of this. There's a variety of other ones, but it's a different way of thinking about policy. And I'll end there, so thanks.
So I'll just start with one question, because I think it comes out of your discussion about complexity. Is how do you actually have a discussion about complexity in Washington, right? Because I think one of the implications is it has to be a fairly nuanced discussion. In fact, if you've got 100 equilibrium points, and if you hear, I really believe there are people in Washington who think in incredibly nuanced ways, but not in the public. And there tends to be okay, it's either black or white, or if you elect me, I will solve all your problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's very difficult, even if you believe in this frame, to actually go out and articulate it. When I talked to your co-author, Roland, he told me a wonderful story about a politician in the Netherlands who talked as though, he talked like a complexity expert, and he lost the election, right? Because he seemed kind of wishy-washy, and he said, I can't predict this, I need principles, right? Mm-hmm. So, how do you do that? Because I think that's one of the fundamental issues that anybody here will run into, is sort of how can you articulate this without getting, politically slammed?
I don't have the answer. Remember, Alfred Kahn said, he never talked to me. I quickly pulled out of it, and it's extraordinarily hard. No, I think, sort of the individuals at the top level, any policymaker understands that. And the question is, how do you provide it? What I hope to do with this book is sort of undermine sort of that standard approach that here, you have to put it into this simple framework and sort of get it out to more people, that it's there to give politicians who want to talk about the nuances more cover. And that's the only way I have it, because, so politics is beyond me. I'll deal with complex systems, nonlinear dynamic systems, but I can't touch politics because, so it is hard. I was down here for a couple years, sort of there, and, sort of, it just went beyond me. And I have this tendency to speak out. That's not a good tendency, I discovered, sort of with my ex-wife, who was a FOB.
So when I read your book, it started to sort of lead me back to the Cass Sunstein book, Nudge.
Mm-hmm.
Have people read Nudge? Right? They have a principle in there. I think it's libertarian paternalism or something, right? And obviously that, it's come out of the behavioral economics theory. There's actually, I think, a nudge unit in the UK government now. So it's actually been internalized in the political system. Yeah. How would you differentiate your sort of approach from the nudge folks?
The nudge folks, sort of want to sort of add behavioral economics onto the standard control model. So here we have, libertarianism, the market works, but we just have to nudge some. Unfortunately, if people are really nudgeable, then of course sort of the model, that control model that sort of says here the market isn't going to work. So they're adding it on to something that it can't be added on to because the assumption undermines it, and that's sort of the contradiction. Now, it's partially correct. I think, so we talk about differentiating ours with SuperNudges versus nudges. The nudges are the small stuff that can get there, but the real policy gains will be in SuperNudges, and that means starting to say that norms, that tastes, are not exogenous, as they're assumed in the economic control model. But norms are endogenous. Tastes are endogenous. So if you're dealing, say, with climate change, the way to affect climate change is going to have to be through changing people's tastes. Where here, sort of the materialism that, sort of has developed has to change. And that's an enormously difficult conversation to have. But I think it's a conversation that had. If we go back and look at John Stuart Mill and sort of the classical economists, they fully expected sort of the profit motive to sort of disappear, because the economic problem was going to be solved. So they saw as we got affluent, people won't care about economics. It'll move to other things. We developed a system, sort of corporations, whose goal it was to fulfill it. And they did a fantastic job. But they also sort of gained here, to continue to exist, we have to sort of continually advertise and change taste so people want more and more. As you've done that, you sort of have a system. The way into terms of changing it as an ongoing system has to, in my view, involve changing tastes, in a much fun way, and dealing with that question. And that's a question, sort of that politicians are hesitant to deal with, and that economists haven't such. So we just assume, sort of the consumer sovereignty is there. Tastes are given. And yet if you look, tastes evolve over time.
Just one more question, then I'll turn it over. One of the things that is interesting to ponder is how long it would take to go from some of the operational principles that you talked about into governance principles. So, we go back, you mentioned tipping points, which obviously goes back to, there's lots of discussion. In the 70s, Gladwell wrote this book, it becomes popularized, all of a sudden people kind of get it. So, but there's probably decades there. Do we have enough time to wait, essentially, before we actually begin to think in a complexity frame?
See, I don't know, in any answer to that question. Do we have enough time? Things continue. So in some ways, sort of it will evolve as it will evolve. And yes, we might not answer it at the right time, but eventually people will see if it's correct. Here's the way we have to do it. Things evolve slowly over time. I think what's changing is, sort of the training that people get. And in here, one of the things we suggest is the big change is that people should be trained as social scientists, not as economists or sociologists or anthropologists or anything else. They should all have the same set of training, which would allow a conversation that would exist that otherwise doesn't exist. So sort of the approach goes back in thinking, what's the institutional structure that's allowing this to sort of replicate itself? And sort of the way we've sort of redefined sort of the various social science disciplines has sort of created this separation and this lack of concern. So if we change that, eventually I think you'll change the other things and have that coming in. So we had, John Kenneth Galbraith wrote, the book on, sort of affluence. We're an affluent society. That pushed him out. He was no longer an economist. It wasn't that it wasn't important, it just wasn't economics, because economists didn't talk about that. And somehow the goal is, of course, economists should talk about all those sets of issues, as should everyone else.
I hope that you've provoked some folks here. Let's have some questions. We're actually videotaping this, so if you could just raise your hand. Tell us who you are, where you're from. whether you're an economist maybe. And use the mic, please. Thanks.
Joel Yutkin. I'm Principal High Road Strategies in Industrial and Economic and an Energy Consultancy in Arlington. Yeah, I guess in theory I have an economics I'm a reluctant economist.
Aren't we all?
With an initially an engineering background, I'm a systems guy, and so I have kind of over time an eclectic social, political, economics background, but I do apply economics to, and I do work with modelers and so on. And I basically, fundamentally on this, first of all, I really appreciate the fact that I'd like to read your book. I haven't had a chance to, and then I'm glad to see that the complexity issue and discussion is beginning to make its way in this town in particular. There's other people beginning to talk about that. Rob Atkinson has talks a lot about this in terms of evolutionary economics and so on. So the one fundamental that I keep on coming back to, and you kind of eschewed talking about politics, but I don't see how you can ultimately go back to politics. Having myself also worked on the Hill, most of our policymakers are operating from an economics 101 framework. Even those who are considered more open to government role, et cetera, they still operate. The market is the ultimate king here, and they believe, frankly, I've come to the conclusion that our economic theory is wrong. I mean, it's not just simply, need to be tweaked. We really need to have a new revolution in economic theory down to the basic level in academia, and it has to be building around a complexity and evolutionary approaches and so on. Some of the work at Santa Fe Institute and so on as well, I think, can play a very important role here. But, when you come back to our current debate on the Hill and seeing this gridlock, what seems to be a fundamental issue is this relationship of market and government. We have, and I think the public itself does not seem to understand this linkage, except in the breach, when people have to apply it, they want government to do things. But in the end, I think that's a fundamental point here that you're making, that when you talk about libertarianism, that seems to be a tremendous gap between what you're presenting and what others are trying to present, and what that philosophy that's gaining more and more ground in this town, which is one of the reasons it's harder to even talk about it than even before, even a decade ago. And I just wanted to, I maybe I'm making a little bit of a statement, but I also like to get some response to it, because I think we need to have a discussion about that.
Yeah, we spend a couple chapters there sort of discussing sort of the market fundamentalist view and sort of the economics of control view. And one of the things I think that's important to sort of recognize, the economics of control view that sort of specify government, can solve problems, came first, and the market fundamentalists of Chicago was a reaction to that. Sort of because they felt here is portraying it as scientific that government can solve everything. The earlier ones, classical economists, supported laissez-faire. But within sort of the support of laissez-faire, you had activists who wanted more government action and non-activists. So Hayek and Keynes, we have a discussion, were very close in terms of their overall view of the system. They had different proclivities, but that was something quite different. And that's one of the things we hope, sort of to get established. And there's the famous sort of story of iPencil. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it shows up. You can just do a Google search for it. There's stories there. It's the story of a pencil. He tells this genealogy. And here, how this cooperation just develops totally on its own, with no government intervention. Isn't it wonderful? And we have to rely on the market. So you can go on Liberty, sort of, and find it there. It's wonderful. And it's true. It's sort of an evolutionary story. We have a chapter devoted to telling the continuation of that story. But it sort of adds that here, all these things work only because we also have government, which sort of evolved and sort of developed and intertwined with the market. And I think if that just gets developed into that, the evolutionary view, the complexity view, is that everything is endogenous. So therefore, government is not, sort of existing. It can change. It has changed, and it's part of the evolutionary system. So we have the market system that we have only because we have the government that we have. And so you have to think of these as two combined things. And there's different roles for government. One is sort of a control role, and that's kind of scary, sort of there. The other is sort of the nudge role, where it's really trying to say, we don't know what people want, but we want people to think about what you really want and encourage them to get together and discuss and sort of arrive at things. And that's why it's all bottom-up policies that are developing. So the social, sort of for-benefit institutions are private institutions that are reflecting the desires of individuals there. So they're very much part of the market. But we hope that, sort of think that when you put these together and make it easier for them, they will be able to start solving problems that government was being relied upon to do, or nonprofits, that they will sort of dominate there if they're given a chance. So how do you give them sort of this initial chance? So I think if we can change the discussion that way, it can really, sort of play a role, because people see that.
Just a clarification, because in the book you talked a little bit about the for-benefit institutions, and I think you mentioned California as a state that actually recognizes those.
There's, again, probably 27 states now that have, sort of various types of regulation on that. We mentioned California because they have 2 laws actually for it. And the one that I supported more is the Flexible Purpose Corporation. So there's big fights within this. You have to understand B Corps and everything else are very much being discussed. But a B Corp is simply something that's specified by the B Lab, sort of as meeting certain criteria that they have specified. And so I'm part of a project now that's sort of looking, how do you classify all these things and what's happening? Because very quickly, everybody sort of wants to get involved and sort of have their particular corporation seen as something. And so, again, it sort of plays a role, but that's what I'm beginning to think is policy. You really have to get involved and your hands dirty in sort of understanding things that go way beyond.
My name is Leroy Kaskus. I'm an economist at the Bureau of Labor Statistics on technology. You start your book mentioning interest in climate change, and there's a lot of wonderful economics work being done by Nordhaus and Jorgensen's book and the people in the carbon tax, all of which a lot of people think that are trying to ignore and move away from. And the economics in climate field is really very high quality and complex and deep levels of understanding. What makes you think that a complexity view of these same problems would not be rejected the same way that the economics is?
I'm often rejected, so that doesn't stop me from doing anything. But in the sense, we offer a little different take on the climate change than that, because what we say is if you put it in the standard models and start talking about it and actually look, it's much harder to see how politically it can evolve. On the other hand, if you say tastes, if you start to enter in, the tastes are endogenous. And how much people want, sort of materialistic is endogenous. And if people change and sort of get their kicks from achieving social goals as opposed from achieving private materialistic goals, then you have a win-win situation. And that's the way we argue it has to be thought about. If you're going to do it, because the amount of change that has to occur is so major, and it has to occur globally, where we don't have a global government. So it's got to evolve in different ways. So what one government can do independently without this other one is extremely limited. So there's those dimensions. So that's how I think we change that debate. Sort of, do I think it'll have a lot of effect? No. I've been struggling against the economics profession, sort of working on things all my life, and I have very little effect. But once in a while, so I can see some effect that goes on, and that's what makes life fun.
Wait a second, I'll get you a mic.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm Jonathan Boston. I'm from New Zealand. I'm a Fulbright Fellow here in Washington for a few months, and it's great to come and be able to participate in an event like this. I've been working on climate change issues in New Zealand, at least in the Australasian area, a rather depressing area at the moment because the Australian government has just abandoned its carbon tax. But I have a number of observations and then questions. Climate change is a wicked problem, or super wicked problem. And not all policy problems are as difficult as climate change. And one of the things I'd just like you to comment on, Dave, if you would, is just the relevance of complexity approaches to different types of problems, because some problems you can say actually aren't that complex and don't require really, highly sophisticated efforts to solve, inverted commas. We've more or less managed to eradicate polio and smallpox and so on. Maybe not quite, but just about, not particularly hard relative to climate change. Second, in relation to climate change, you make a distinction between the kind of approach that, if you like, traditional economists might take using price-based mechanisms, whether it's a carbon tax or emissions trading scheme, in a sense, a kind of a top-down approach. You make a distinction perhaps between that and your approach of changing people's tastes. Influencing people's tastes, yes, yeah. And I suppose a few observations just very quickly. I've just been in Scandinavia. It's pretty clear that people in Scandinavia have a rather different value set. And I would say it's not just about tastes, it's actually values, it's norms, yes. To say in the US and maybe Australia and New Zealand, there's clearly a much, much stronger collective commitment to environmental sustainability and all that means than in some other jurisdictions. But it begs the question, how do you change people's values? It seems to me that's not straightforward. And I guess I'd just like to put forward a third option, which is not just about, price-based mechanisms, tastes, but it's also about using other instruments, which is, investing heavily in research and development to build and come up with new technologies that undercut fossil fuels at a price level, so that you don't actually have to change people's tastes particularly. You just have to get them to choose, or some people to choose, different modes of producing electricity and different modes of transportation. And that isn't necessarily the consumer. It will be other people in the system. It may be we need to do all three. I mean, my personal view would be it would be very sensible to have an emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax. We clearly do need to change people's values, and we also need to do research. But it's pretty clear that at the moment it's very, very difficult in most countries to get a price-based system operational.
I'd agree with pretty much everything that he said. In the book, we're very clear that we are not saying the complexity, sort of framework for policy replaces sort of the standard economic policy. Remember, I sort of said we have a set of tools, and then we have a set of problems, and you're matching those. So very much I agree, different types of problems have it. And the economist's way of framing things is extraordinarily important and extraordinarily useful. It added enormous insight. The problem is all the free gigantic dinners are gone. We've used those, and now we've gotten down to where we're sort of trying to squeak out free lunches. What we're arguing is this other framework that starts to has some gigantic gourmet dinners that you can sort of get free by sort of operating there. And it's initially, it will go down, and then that'll be used up. And then one will need another one. So it's, again, this evolutionary view of the way in which policy frameworks work. So that was the first point. Climate change, sort of not being straightforward, totally agree with that, sort of value change. And it doesn't say don't have carbon tax. I've supported carbon tax for a long time. So I just don't think that'll be enough, even if we could get it. That was there. Because of, the global dimension of that problem is going to add other parts. As to investment, the question is, who does the investment and how? And again, if it's sort of coming from the bottom up because people have it, sort of there as, people deciding here, this is what I'd like to do and achieve it, that sort of fits in with the change of values. And the for benefit institutions, a lot of people, when you talk to investors, they are worried about much more than just making money. They're worried about achieving different ends, and they'll make that. What happens if you have government coming in and sort of providing sort of really the choice, it's a free investment. So you get, here, if you invest in this, you get your normal rate of return, and you get this feel good because you're doing the investment. You get a whole bunch of people trying to figure out how can we take advantage of that, and that undermines support for what might happen there. So I think, that's where we might have a little bit of a disagreement, sort of how that works, sort of as you have it, because you want, in sort of my framework, as much happening from the bottom up as possible. So it goes back to more changing values and tastes, and then they get reflected as to what people want. And that's something we say, we haven't solved that yet.
Yep.
I'm Warren Prunella with a consulting firm, Econometrica. Spent, 30 or 40 years in regulatory economics. And and I am an economist, but if I had taken no more than the first semester microeconomics in college, it sounds like everything that you're talking about is broken down into talking about determinants of supply and demand, and maybe trying to just move the curves out or in, and the different ways, you can think of control. If you think smoking is bad, government control might be to ban it. And to talk about, your nudge, it sounds like maybe the kind of advertisements that some people are putting out with nasty pictures to try to just shift the demand curve for tobacco. So although it's complexity that you're talking about, it seems that it's really just a simple discussion of moving supply and demand curves around. Taste and preferences, you can run through the determinant supply and demand, the profit maximization affecting the supply curves. Is it more than that?
I think it's more than that. In the sense, supply and demand, you think of it, and you think of a single equilibrium. So that's the way you're sort of thinking about it. How do you move to equilibrium? Within complexity, you're picturing thousands of basins of attractions, sort of in a ball sort of rolls down there, and it got stuck in one and another. So you think of policy not only as how do we move to an equilibrium with one of these equilibria, but here there's other equilibria there, and there's models that shed light on it. How do we push the ball up just enough so it'll start rolling down into this other one? And how do we compare them? That's a different way of thinking about it than the simple supply and demand. So I agree, I write a principles text. So yes, I can tell lots of stories with supply and demand, but it doesn't sort of see policy, government policy, really as a catalyst, not as solving the problem. So what, this complexity view does, policy really is only going to catch on is if it sort of generates feedback systems that operate, that will achieve a change that goes far beyond what will actually be done. And so if you think of just government trying to control, say, exchange rates, when the market is 1,000 times bigger than what the government can put in, the way they do it is, of course, thinking about here we will put in strategically and try and be a catalyst to sort of move the markets and sort of where the market expectations are. That's the way I think policy needs to be thought about. That's not something that follows directly from the supply-demand model.
Network. Sorry, Brenda Afsel, Children's Environmental Health Network. I am not an economist. I don't balance my checkbook.
I don't balance mine either.
I don't think people do that anymore. But this is a really simple question. How
They're the
important?
hard ones.
How important is it that the problem you're trying to solve is clearly defined before you start?
It's not. In other words, the problems I'm really talking about cannot be clearly defined before you start. The definition of it evolves over time. So you try and define it as carefully as you can. And if you can fully define it, then it's no longer a complex problem. in a sense, then you can sort of figure it out. Defining the problem and solving the problem oftentimes sort of evolve together. And so this accepts that you cannot define the problem, that problem, you'll be learning about the problem as you do it. So there's learning by doing as it happens.
I think one of the issues here is that, we operate, most of those of us in the government, it's a very top-down legal system. And the tendency is we want to solve problems once and for all, right? We want to pass some law and the problem just goes away. The first issue of the Clean Air Act was, I think, 15 or 30 pages. The next issue that came out was 1,000. So we have to revisit these problems. So I think there's also a tendency in the legal profession, because we've talked about the economist, obviously, and the politicians. A lot of those politicians are trained as lawyers. So there's a strong kind of legal bias. But I think in the system, there's also there's a sense of we can pass a law and solve this. What you're implying is we have to keep going back all the time and revisit this.
And that was really sort of what they meant by laissez-faire. You don't try and solve it. You let individuals sort of design the system so that individuals solve the problems from the bottom up. And so it's the designing of the system to have individuals solving the problem, not trying to solve the problem top down. That's really the key to sort of understanding what's going on. Let me just, for a while there was enormous interest in, sort of complexity here in Washington. And so I came down, gave a number of seminars and lectures, sort of complexity consultant. And what I found people were looking for were sort of, give us a model that solves this problem. And here, there were a whole group of people selling complexity models. That would go. And I sort of went down and said, a model isn't going to help you at all, because it's sort of the design of the model, the understanding of it, that was really there. You need the person who designed it, who sort of integrated with it, because the model and sort of the modeler cannot be separated. So you aren't going to have something off the shelf that's going to answer it. So here, a lot of these were agent-based models. And I said, they're not really going to provide you with any more answers than anything else, because to use a model, you have to understand all its assumptions, everything that was made, why you made them, what's going on. That's the way it gets integrated into policy, and that's extraordinarily difficult.
More questions? Let me just ask you one more thing, because we talked a little bit about this when we had our phone interview, and that was the role of the media and the ability or inability of the media to actually frame complexity in any way that's even close to reality. I mean, the media is kind of going the same way the political system. It's kind of black and white, and there's no nuance. And I think there's kind of an incestuous feedback loop, actually, between the media now and the political system. So most of the complexity is just driven out of the system in terms of the way the media covers it.
I don't know if the complexity is driven out, but the talking about complexity is driven out. Because, of course, if you take a complexity point of view, it's all nuance, sort of there. And, sort of nuance is something that doesn't work well within media and doesn't work well within politics, which is why I go retreat to my sort of academic, sort of walls, sort of, because there I can sort of talk about nuance, because what I say isn't important. If it actually was important, then I'd have to stop talking about nuance. So I have a strong incentive not to be important.
One for one Dave and one for the other Dave. A Lyle writer. I've operated the wheels and levers of government for a lot of years. One point is just to bring you up to date, I guess, on the profile of members of Congress. If you take a look at the surveys by the American Political Science Association, you'll find out there the proportions have switched. We now have more businessmen, people with business backgrounds in Congress, than we do have lawyers. That's, I think, determines some of the outcomes, not all of them. But the other thing for Dave Colander is, Dave, I think there are a couple of words that you don't want to use around Washington, D.C., and they're called social policy, because those are an anathema. So if you have any of that in the book, please excise it as quickly as possible.
Can I talk about social dimensions to economic?
That's much more
Okay.
Yeah, right here.
I'm a lawyer by trade, and I've just a little question. Are we actually able to create real incentives for any government to start using the entire toolbox you want them to use to provide better governance? I don't think so.
I think most people want better governance. I think most politicians want it. So I don't think we have to provide incentives. I think those incentives are part of the overall system that's there. The question is, if the institutional structure makes it very hard to do that, but the inherent part of wanting good government, I think most people are good. The question is, sort of, can we encourage, sort of that to come out? And that's an extraordinarily difficult, wicked problem. But I think it's one problem that has to be seen. We talk a lot, we have a chapter in the book sort of talking about changes in government that would make it, sort of more possible. And, because we say, it doesn't say a complexity framework whether more things should be done through government or less. That's a separate issue. That's involved, specific questions, and you have to answer that. But here are some things it seems. If, politics seems to undermine a lot of it, so you need more government, like civil service was a wonderful invention to sort of separate out, here's what, sort of the people think, and here's what's done. Thinking about how to sort of separate out what government can do to achieve ends from the politics and sort of redesigning government to that are things that should be part of the discussion, part of the policy discussion, because it is what will make government work. So we can make government work. It isn't here. It's the question, do we want to have the changes there? We can make the market work, but it's whether we want the changes. So you have to be looking at, not here we have government that's given. It's here we have changing governmental institutions, here we have changing market institutions. Very much thinking of that way is what I call the complexity policy framework.
I'm Ross Capon, a consultant, not an economist, but I minored in economics. I just had a very simple question. Could you tell me again, 27 states have what kind of laws?
Laws that support for-benefit corporations. So in other words, a corporation whose goal is not specified to maximize profit, okay? Whose goal is to achieve some, social goal in addition to that. Now that was to give cover to firms that wanted to sort of take on social goals, but which thought that the laws specified that you had to maximize profit. If you actually look at the laws and go through it, they don't specify that. It's extraordinarily complex and you get into legal stuff. But it did give cover, and the second, it encourages the development of those type.
And the distinction with a 501c3 nonprofit is?
This is, the difference between a for-benefit and a nonprofit is governance. So if we take universities, universities are governed by faculty. So we're nonprofit, but here we're, achieving the end. So we're worried about faculty. If you take a for-benefit institution, it's sort of trying to achieve the goal. How could we most cheaply provide quality education for students, even if it means disrupting the existing institutional structure, which it does? So, sort of this would try and achieve that end, so the governance would be with the entrepreneur, with the owner, trying to achieve the social end of achieving benefits. So it's the structure in which it's done, is really the change.
I think we've reached the end of the hour. Thank you for coming to
Good.
Washington.
Thank you.
I hope we can get you back here again. There's some books out there if you're interested in picking up one of David's books, and you're going to stick around for a while, right?
Yep.
Okay, great, thank you. And we're going to have more talks like this, so please leave us your emails. Thank you. Yeah, great, thanks.
Thanks.